Our coalition will stay until our work is done.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces.
20 years after a US-led coalition first began its attack on Afghanistan, the once defeated Taliban are now back in power in the war-torn country. Both nationals and foreigners alike are frantically attempting to flee the country as Taliban insurgents take control of Kabul. But how did America manage to fail in a mission it declared as accomplished over 18 years ago? The seeds of the current situation in Afghanistan were sown all the way back in 1985, when the US began funding the Mujahideen, a coalition of Islamic forces who formed an alliance to fight against the Soviet-backed Afghan government. The US-backed Mujahideen went on to defeat the Soviets, but its legacy would go on to defeat the US over 35 years later. Within 7 years of the US backing the Afghan rebels, Soviet troops had left Afghanistan and the former government was ousted as the Soviet Union crumbled. But what remained was a brutal civil war that raged on for more than a decade. This vacuum allowed a new, relatively unknown militia to gain control, the Taliban. The Taliban was created in September 1994 with just 50 students from the city of Kandahar. Their leader was unhappy that traditional Islamic law had not been implemented in Afghanistan after the end of communist rule, and now pledged to rid Afghanistan of warlords and criminals. Within months, 15,000 students, mostly Afghan refugees in Pakistan, had joined the group. The Taliban then moved to take Kabul, but suffered a devastating defeat to government forces. As they retreated, Taliban forces began shelling the city, killing civilians. The Taliban regrouped and in September 1996 began preparing for another major offensive against the city. This time, government forces retreated, and on the 27th of September 1996, the Taliban entered Kabul and established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. On September 11th, 2001, 4 California-bound passenger jets were hijacked by Al-Qaeda. In total, 2,996 people were killed and 25,000 others injured. Within a month, the US, aided by several other countries, began bombing Taliban and Al-Qaeda related camps. By November, Kabul had fallen. By the end of 2001, the Taliban gave up Kandahar, their last stronghold. After successfully defeating the Taliban in Afghanistan, President George W. Bush announced a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, similar to the one that revitalized Western Europe after World War II. However, developments were inadequately funded, and the attention quickly shifted when the US and coalition forces invaded Iraq. This meant that the troops needed to continue the fight against the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda outside of Kabul, especially to the south, simply didn't exist.
We're at a point where we clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction.
On May 1st, 2003, US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced an end to major combat in Afghanistan the same day that Bush announced mission accomplished in Iraq.
Our coalition will stay until our work is done.
The first democratic Afghan elections were held since the fall of the Taliban on October 9th, 2004. Approximately 80% of registered voters turned out to give Hamid Karzai a full 5-year term. However, Karzai's reign as president was marred by corruption, and his efforts to build a national army or police force were troubled from the start. When US forces first entered Afghanistan, the Taliban had focused on battling them in open combat with little success. However, at this point they changed their focus to the use of suicide bombings and IEDs. Between January 2005 and August 2006, Afghanistan endured 64 suicide attacks, a tactic that had been virtually unknown in the country's history before then. In March 2009, US President Barack Obama announced that an extra 4,000 personnel would train and bolster the Afghan army and police. By the end of 2009, Obama had doubled down on this tactic by sending an extra 30,000 troops to Afghanistan, now bringing the total number to 100,000 troops. By comparison, When Bush and Rumsfeld declared mission accomplished back in 2003, there were just 8,000 US troops in the country. A NATO summit in 2012 endorsed the plan to withdraw foreign combat troops by the end of 2014. A year later, President Karzai and Pakistan's Asif Ali Zardari agreed to work on an Afghan peace deal, urging Taliban leaders to do the same. In 2014, a new Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, was sworn in, and the US, Britain and NATO ended their combat operations in Afghanistan. In May 2015, informal peace talks were held between Taliban and Afghan officials. Both sides agreed to continue talks at a later date, however the Taliban insisted they would not stop fighting until all foreign troops left. Later that year, Obama announced that nearly 10,000 US troops would remain in Afghanistan until the end of 2016, before extending this to nearly 8,500 troops in 2017. On February 29th, 2020, the US and the Taliban signed a deal on the path to peace. The deal included guarantees from the Taliban that the country would not be used for terrorist activities and that they will continue peace talks with the Afghanistan government. The US agreed for a significant drawdown of US troops. The deal did not include a commitment to peace in Afghanistan. In September, the intra-Afghan peace talks began after 5,000 Taliban prisoners were released. In November, the US announced plans to reduce the number of troops in Afghanistan to 2,500 by January, just days before Joe Biden's inauguration. At the same time, peace talks in Afghanistan were deadlocked as deadly attacks continued. Despite this, though, in April 2021, Joe Biden committed to withdraw all troops by September 11, 2021, regardless of the state of peace talks in the country. As the US withdrew, the burden of securing the country's safety fell to the Afghan National Army. With over 300,000 personnel, compared to the estimated 58,000 to 100,000 armed Taliban fighters, many would have expected the Afghan forces to hold the country for far longer. However, a lack of coordination and poor morale was the army's undoing. The Taliban can paint themselves as those who are resisting and fighting occupation, which is something that is kind of near and dear to what it means to be an Afghan, whereas that's a much harder thing for the government to claim, or the military forces fighting for the government. And on 15th of August 2021, the Taliban once again took the capital city of Kabul, and with it, once again, took control of the country that the US and its allies took from them 20 years ago. The US funded the Mujahideen to defeat the Soviets with no plan for what came next, allowed civil war to rage in the aftermath, ignored the Taliban after prematurely claiming victory, signed a peace deal that didn't include peace, failed to properly prepare a national army, and then left the country regardless of whether the warring parties would reach peace.